The world's headlines scream change in the United States. Across Europe, in Asia, Africa and elsewhere, the consensus seems to be that this was the best result.
Obama. Obama.
He's going to improve the economy, says this man in Beijing. Clinton improved the economy and George Bush ruined it.
I think it would have been horrific if it had been the Republicans in place again. It's just great news.
President-elect Obama might not have heard of the town of Obama in Japan, but they've certainly heard of him. Hawaii-style celebrations followed news of the US election result. My best wish is for world peace, said this man, and I'd like him to show his leadership in order to achieve that. Japan, like the rest of Asia and much of the world, has endured months of financial market instability triggered by the US economic crisis. News of the Obama win caused Asian stocks to rally, a trend world markets will hope to see continue in the coming days. The expectation that Obama will fix the global economy is just the beginning. He also bears the hopes of many that a breath of fresh air in the White House will breathe new life into the world's most intractable problems. Seldom in history has a president-elect had so much to live up to so soon. But not often has the promise of new leadership in Washington had such genuine global appeal. Close to his heart, but a million miles away, these are celebrations in Kenya. The family connection means support here may be unconditional. The world's support depends now, though, not on promise, but results.
Seamus, you've seen the images. In light of the economic recession in America, can Obama manage all these high expectations around the world without sounding too distant or too weak?
I mean, obviously it's impossible for him to match this level of expectation, whatever he was like. I mean, you know, this election has been won partly about on the back of the disaster of the war on terror in Iraq, but more especially out of the economic crisis, which has been an absolutely enormous global event, and obviously has had a huge impact in America. It'll have a huge impact to come. And I would say that he's more likely to have an impact within the US on a bigger scale, a more radical scale, than what we'd like to see outside. I mean, I think there's going to be much more talking to people, a different tone, a much greater enthusiasm to find allies, less unilateralism. But actually, if you read the fine print about what he's been saying, I mean, there's actually a good deal more continuity than change, which is promised.
Dr. Gopal, you're a literary critic of sorts. Do you think he can talk his way out of the mess he's in?
Not necessarily. I mean, I think he's a deeply intelligent man and he's extremely well read. But if you read his writings, the small print, as Seamus calls it, he's actually very clever in talking about change and in using metaphors and images of change. But if you actually look at what he says, as Seamus again pointed out, a lot of it promises continuity. His critique of Bush is not that Bush, in some sense, was wrong in his sense of America as the leader of the free world, of America as carrying out its manifest destiny. His critique of Bush is for having gone wrong by having focused on Iraq as opposed to other parts of the world like Afghanistan.
But the world's perception is that, in fact, he's going to depart from, not continue.
That may be the perception.
Erroneous?
I think, well, I don't want to say erroneous in the sense that, of course, a degree of change will come in. He is a new man. He comes in with a new perspective. He brings in something that very few American politicians have, which is a sort of experience of the world outside Europe and America. He has lived in and been to places in Asia and in Africa, and I think that will biographically and in terms of his experience account for something. But we also should not underestimate the extent to which he is quite deeply embedded in what he calls, reclaiming America, and the idea of America is very important to him.
The fact is that expectations of change also generate their own pressures, and that's true domestically, but internationally as well. And by having generated, in the way that Priya said, this huge expectations through these symbolic and metaphorical images, I think it will create pressures on him which may have their own outcomes which we can't foresee at the moment.
But frankly, Tariq, regardless of the recession in America, it's still the superpower, probably the most powerful in history of mankind, and he is the president, and the president does decide, at least on foreign policy. So why not? Why shouldn't he walk the talk instead of just talking the talk?
Well, I think a lot will depend on what the US military wants. The US military, let us remember, and the Pentagon especially, was deeply divided on the war on Iraq, divided on how to proceed in Afghanistan. So if Obama gets a signal from within the American military establishment that enough is enough, I think he will pull out. I don't think he has anything riding on staying there. I mean, it's always dangerous when American presidents decide that they're going to manage history and transform history. It never works.
And I heard the last reports, Stryker, that perhaps he might keep Robert Gates as his Secretary of Defense, and having, of course, Petraeus, General Petraeus, head of the Central Command. I actually don't see any change.
Well, two things. First of all, I think that whoever was going to be president over the next year or two was going to be withdrawing troops from Iraq. I think Bush has been talking about it. And in fact,
but only combat troops.
But that's
not
what
the
yeah,
150,000.
that's all Obama's talking about too. But there is one thing about Gates. It is true that he is Secretary of Defense in the Bush administration, but he was also Director of Intelligence at the CIA at the time when they were talking about WMD, and he was actually on the skeptical side. He was basically overrun and overridden by Cheney and Rumsfeld.
But today he supports increasing the troops in Afghanistan.
Yes, well,
And so does
Obama.
President-elect Obama.
And so would McCain, and so would President Bush, and so does Gordon Brown in this country. So I think the thing to remember that in America, as perhaps here too, there is a kind of establishment foreign policy. And anybody who's president kind of operates within those parameters, I think.
So, Stryker, I think it is worth pointing out that the intelligence in Britain, British intelligence, British diplomats in Afghanistan, as well as US intelligence sources, are now beginning to say quite openly that the war in Afghanistan is lost.
Yes.
And which is why you have these panic negotiations taking place with the neo-Taliban. I mean, if all was well, you wouldn't be discussing with the people
Absolutely.
who are fighting you.
And
that's true.
what does it say to have Biden as his vice president when Biden's foreign policy experience and record is known to all of us? He wants even to divide perhaps Iraq into confederates, and he wants certainly to have more troops in Afghanistan. Once again, he considers himself a Zionist.
Well, I mean, that was clearly an electoral insurance policy, wasn't it? I mean, it was, one of the attacks on Obama was that he had no experience in foreign policy and that he was perceived as being this liberal and he would somehow not protect American power. And by appointing Biden, that was a way of offsetting that. But I mean, actually, it's much more than that. If you see what Obama said in the last few months, in quite a few points, he's actually taken a more hawkish line than McCain. I mean, notably on Pakistan, on hot pursuit in Pakistan,
and Iran in some ways.
And Iran. He said, for example, that he won't accept any kind of nuclear program in Iran. Whereas McCain has qualified him.
But the big question for me, Priya, in particular, I think for the time being, we don't know much about what he would actually do, except that we know what he himself, or how he presented himself as a black American candidate. Can he transform his own pedigree into leadership? Can he actually be a transformative president as he was a transformative candidate?
Well, I mean, that can certainly be the hope. As I said earlier, I mean, he also has a background that is as much African as it is American. And one of the things I would say to him, if I could, converse with him, is when he talks about freedom, he repeatedly uses the American notion of freedom. And the idea of America as the liberator of the world, the idea of America as the liberator of formerly colonial countries, which is actually not really the case. But I find it amazing that someone who comes from Kenya, which is the place where one of the world's great anti-colonial freedom movements was fought, that he actually makes no allusion to that heritage of freedom fighting and that heritage of people seeking freedom.
Well, he can now, if he wants to.
Gentlemen, we're going to have to leave it at that. Dr. Priya, thank you for joining us. But before we go, we're going to look at some of those images that maybe some of us will probably miss in the future.
Well, I think this. I think
the enemies of freedom are not idle. And now is the time for freedom.
no threat will prevent freedom-loving people from defending freedom.
This is a dangerous world.
We're dealing with evil people.
An enemy that wants to strike us.
The terrorist networks.
Only motivation is evil.
An axis of evil.
Be chaos.
Weapons of mass destruction.
And out of chaos would become vacuums.
We will never surrender to evil.
We cannot be.
And there's still an enemy that lurks.
We cannot.
I wish I wouldn't have to talk about war. No president wants to be a war president.
We're making great progress.
We cannot fear terrorists.
We're making great progress. As you know, I'm not going to comment on a specific operation.
So I'm coming to you as an optimistic fellow. It took a while for the credit system to freeze up. It's going to take a while for the credit system to thaw.
I call upon all nations to do everything they can to stop these terrorist killers. Thank you. Now watch this dry. See you at church.